Hey, okay. My name is Anna Bulbrook. I run something called Girl School, and I am so excited to be working with Compound to be bringing interdisciplinary programming and music programming to this gorgeous new space. This conversation is the first part of that collaboration, and we're going to be talking about the language of empathy today. And I have three absolutely super incredible humans that I couldn't be more excited to see in little boxes with me. This is like my most exciting like celebrity squares. We have Allison Davis. Allison is a writer, producer, former curator. Also, that we can play the "Is Anna Getting Your Bio Right" game. She's currently adapting The Black Kids, a young adult novel by Christina Hemmings Reid for the Gotham Group, and is a producer and writer for American Horror Story. Recently, she was a producer and writer on David Makes Man for OWN. She's also worked with Barry Jenkins, including on a little film you might have heard of called Moonlight. And in a past life, she was the Associate Artistic Director of the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts in New York, and a senior story producer at Google. So Allison's just kind of a G. Then we have Yesika. Yesika is one of my favorite poets. She is a Los Angeles-based Salvadoran poet who writes about her family, her culture, her city, her fat brown body. She has shared her work in venues and campuses throughout the country. She's a two-time National Poetry Slam finalist and the recipient of the 2020 International Latino Book Award of Poetry. And her work has been featured in the LA Times, Teen Vogue, Univision, CNN, NPR, TEDx, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She is an internationally recognized body positive activist and the writer of the column Suelta for Remezcla. And she also has written some best-selling poetry books, Corazon, Tesoro, and Hermosa, published with Not a Cult. Forgive my pronunciation. I'm from Boston. And then we have Senay. Senay has been described to me before I met him as the mayor of Long Beach. He is, all right, these are his words, a bad writer, decent street photographer, and aspiring B-list celebrity from Long Beach. A true native to LA street culture, as well as a contributor to the local music scene, Senay is here to say something not on the minds of most. When not eating up more space with his consistently growing record collection, he can usually be found in your favorite blog's comment section trolling you. Senay is also a co-owner of Play Nice, LBC, a vintage sports apparel store, and a true community hub in Long Beach. And Senay, what are you doing right now?
Oh yeah, forgive my square. Right now, I just pulled up to U-Haul because I'm gonna get every Thursday for the last 2 months. I partnered up with Summit Everything, which is a community center ran by Lauren Halsey, and through her, I get the opportunity to give out a couple 100 boxes of fresh produce to the people in Central Long Beach, the neighborhood I grew up in.
So Senay is doing amazing things for the community per usual. What happened with the fridge?
The Long Beach Health Department happened. Yeah, they cited me for X amount of dollars.
Oh, no.
Because I was being self-resilient and filling a void that the city of Long Beach still has been unable to fill, which is speaking to the scarcity of fresh, high fructose corn syrup, preservative impacted and filled foods being available to the poor and needy here in the city. So they came after me, and that's okay. We're still here. We're still maintaining. We just adapted to the situation, and we'll just keep it moving.
So Senay
I'm actually giving more food out now. So.
Oh, that's amazing. Senay had a fridge outside of Play Nice that anyone could come and just take fresh food from. Yeah. That was really cool.
It was empty every single morning. I'd come in at 9 in the morning. I'd leave at 9 at night, completely filled it. Come in 9 in the morning, it would be completely empty. So.
That's super cool. So that's why Senay is in a moving vehicle. Because he's out doing the work. Okay, so I just wanted to, when I was kind of just backing up and looking up the words radical empathy, which is the theme of which is kind of the first curatorial theme of Compound this year. It feels like a really amazing time to be exploring empathy. And if I'm looking to the right, it's because I have everyone parked over to the right so I can look at questions to the left. It just feels like a really amazing time to be thinking about like, how do we connect with each other and how do we use language as a vehicle for that connection, or as ways that we break the links and the chains between those connections. And feels like just a really nice time to be looking at what that sort of currency of language, how it functions and how it's driving connections or not between us, and sort of thinking together about like how this functions in our society. So radical, adjective, especially of change or action relating to or affecting the fundamental nature of something far-reaching or thorough, or advocating or based on thorough or complete political or social change, representing or supporting an extreme or progressive section of a political party. Noun, you can have a radical, and then chemistry, there's a chemistry definition, a group of atoms doing some stuff. Empathy has a lot fewer definitions. Empathy is a noun, and it's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, which is different from sympathy, which has overtones of pity and sorrow, and sympathy has a bunch of sort of layers to it. So empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So you're all here because you work with language, written and spoken. Why are you drawn to language? Like, what is it about words that compel you to begin with? I'm gonna start with Yesika.
Yeah. I'm always ready with and I just realized that I know Senay.
Yeah, you know me.
Used to go. Yes.
Yeah.
You had the shades on, and
yeah.
And now you have that beautiful fro that you didn't have when we used to be in the poetry lounge together.
Right.
But I think for me, for language it's the most accessible thing. We all have language. Like if it's in one way or the other, you know, even not to be ableist, but those hard of hearing have sign language, and so communication is the one thing that we have that can't be taken from us, that can't be manipulated. And so I feel like this is like the most accessible art form for me. Like I don't need, like, you know how sometimes when you're a fan of art, like actual art, sometimes you're like, am I receiving this the right way? Am I looking at what the artist wanted me? Because we've been told that art is this very like gate-kept thing, right? But when it comes to language and to writing stories and telling stories, I can make it as accessible as I want. I could speak to my readers in their language, right? Which is my own language. And I get to build a whole universe within that. And it doesn't, you don't need to have anything else other than being able to speak the language that
We froze.
Finished high school, and I didn't get a formal education. And it's what I could do. Like, who's going to take my words from me? Am I cutting off? Am I breaking up?
Just a little bit, but I think we got, 80% of that.
It just told me right now, unstable. I'm like, I know I'm unstable. So like my computer doesn't.
Hey, rude.
I'm so sorry. Since I'm outside, my Wi-Fi is going to be a little spotty. So just let me know. We'll figure it out.
It's all good.
I think
Allison, what drew you to language?
Yeah, I mean, I everything Yesika said definitely resonated. I also think for me, if in another lifetime, and God willing, in this lifetime, I would love to study formally linguistics, and I always said that would be an alternate path to study for me, because language is always fascinating to me because it's universal yet so specific to the individual and so specific culturally. It defines us in so many ways and defines us down from the broadest of the language we speak down to, accents, to colloquialisms, to slang, to, how we communicate with our families. And it's something that can be so broad and yet so specific. And you can tell so much about the way that we use language with ourselves and with each other, and how, you know, it's so much as communication. And then obviously there's so much nonverbal communication, but I'm just so fascinated at ways that we use language and that it's interpreted, you know. I always say that words mean things, which is such a basic, you know, it's such a basic thought, but I think it's easy to forget that. And we see it, and I'm sure we'll get into this later in the discussion, you know, seeing that in media and journalism, and how we choose to name people, how we choose to name ourselves, right? How we choose to convey ideas. You know, we have this language, and choosing one word over another, choosing to zig instead of zag, can make all the world of a difference in how we see ourselves in this world, in our place in history. You know, the hunter tells a very different story than the lion, right? And they tell it using their words. And so it's just really fascinating to me how we speak to each other and of each other, and the tools that we have in our toolbox to communicate with each other.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
I think for me, language has always been, it's either been a bridge or a weapon, depending on the instances and how I utilize it. I grew up, I guess, in you could say a mixed family background. My father is from Eritrea, and my mother is she's Black American. And for me, I always was in this weird kind of in between spaces with respect to the two separate communities I was in. And language was always this either being used against me in that, you know, I have maybe an accent, or I misspeak, or I don't necessarily catch the cultural context behind certain words, terminology, and vice versa. And so I've always had, as a child, this like maybe too acutely awareness of the power of language, and also how we utilize it in our day to day, which I guess kind of just put me on a pathway to, you know, having these conversations both internally and externally with an outside audience about, you know, how we experience, you know, whether it's like how you were saying with colloquialism or the colloquialisms or the slang, you know, because how I speak in one room doesn't necessarily shape who I am or my experiences in other rooms. And I think that, you know, not to get all, not to get too into it, but it makes me think of like the double consciousness conversation that like Dr. W.B. Du Bois was having about this sense of self and the others, the outward self. I think that comes a lot with this conversation of language, ultimately.
So I actually had this question written for later in the conversation, but I feel like there are multiple people in this room that live in multiple languages. And how do you express empathy when you live between multiple languages and worlds? Like, how do you connect? How do you share the experience of another or float between them?
For me, I feel that, there it goes telling me I'm unstable again.
Every time you start talking, Yesika.
Whatever. And then there was the fly, and I'm like, are you the same fly that was fucking with the debate yesterday? Like, are you revolting? Is that sorry? But when it comes to who sent you? Like, I'm one of the good people. Leave me alone. But when it comes to language, I feel that it's taught me to be patient, to be vulnerable, to and to I had to be okay with someone not understanding all of me all the time, because I can't exist in both languages simultaneously, you know. And I explore that a lot in my work about I don't believe in translating when I write anything in Spanish into English, because if I was moved to write it in Spanish, it was for a specific reason. And I feel that it's caused those that are willing, that are monolingual in English, to take that ride with me and kind of open up their hearts to like what it is to not be able to express 100% of yourself all the time. And I think it's just the one word that comes to me is like vulnerability. Like, it's really vulnerable to be like, I'm always in the middle of two things, dude. Like, like, and I don't know how I don't, and I have to be okay with the fact that I'm never going to be able to bridge both things. And it's caused that in my work, and I think it invites people that come into my writing and don't share that experience with me to imagine what that world would be like. And then when I create in a language they don't understand, they get to experience that. Like, oh, I really wish I knew what she was saying, but I don't. And I'm like, yeah, fool, that's how my mom feels in this country all the time. But but using that as a tool. So I used to see being bilingual as a crutch, because I also mispronounce things all the time. I say things backward in Spanish, and then I'll say them like, and then in English I can't pronounce all the words, and then like I can't say inedible, like whatever, what I'm and so it's made me realize that in my multitudes I am also limited.
Yesika, it's so interesting because I'm learning Spanish now. I've been taking Spanish lessons for a few years. And it started, my best friend is Panamanian, and I used to go to Panama with her a lot, and being frustrated that, everyone would be speaking Spanish. I'm like, what'd she say? What'd she say? And they're like, oh, the shoe's blue. And I'm like, that's not what she said. I was like, I'm gonna learn Spanish. So I started learning, and then when I would go back, it's like I have access to 3 million more people, right? It's so exciting. But it's so interesting to me, again, back to interpretation. There's so much about what you just said that I want to talk about, but it's so interesting to me learning how culturally the world, like the English language and Spanish language, especially learning like the difference. My teacher is Spaniard, my best friend is Panamanian, so they have different words for different things. But learning like how we see the world, something as simple as like de nada versus you're welcome, right? Like of nothing. Like that to me is like cultural, it's like, oh, it's of nothing, don't mention it, and that's like speaks to the warmth of the people. But something like you're welcome, I'm not even sure what that really means. Like you're welcome to be here, like adelante, or like reflexive verbs and falling in love. Like falling in love in Spanish is like I'm falling in love with myself, even if you're talking about someone else, which I think is really beautiful. Or instead of saying I am sad, saying I have sadness, right? And like just these tiny differences that speak to culture and that open up interpretation. I can see why, when you're saying I moved to write in this language, it's because this is the only way I can say this, because this is what this means. That's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, and sorry to interject in you, but like one language is violent for me, and the other one isn't so much. I mean, colonizers sound still, but like in my experience, right? I experienced love and family and home and safety in my mother's language and my father's language, right? And then English was something that I had to learn to survive, to learn to keep my family safe and to keep myself safe. So there will be some things that don't serve me in English, and that's fine. And in Spanish, like I write about love, like when I'm in love in Spanish, because that's how I first learned to love. But like in English, I'll be like, you're beautiful. And then you're like, all right, whatever. And then like in Spanish, you're like, eres hermosa. And then you're like, oh, like I don't even know what you just said, but you rolled an R in there somewhere. Like, But yeah, I'm done taking.
Oh no, thank you. You're absolutely right.
That's fun.
I think to that end, there's also the concept of African American vernacular English too, right? And AAVE being a language with its own rules and grammar and standards. And it's so interesting when especially like this summer with the protests and uprisings and all of these corporations and companies trying to like be on our side and co-op AAVE. And it's like, you can tell immediately, it's so clear, like you can tell so quickly. And that's the closest thing I have, Yesika, to what you're saying is like your original language of family. Like you hear, there's a certain tone, there's a certain cadence, there's certain words that you hear and you're like, oh, okay, I'm with my family now.
Well,
And when people try to fake it, it doesn't work.
even then, like one of my favorite, like in the Puerto community, it's mostly a Black community in LA, right? So when I hear the elders speaking, like the Black community speaking to each other, I'm like, this is a language I don't know, but I'm honored to be able to witness this small exchange they're having, where like the like even like the AAVE, and then even how it changes in generations, and how like a Black woman will say baby to you, and it encompasses so much, you know what I mean? And it's just like such a beautiful thing. And I had never thought of that being like its own language aside from American English, or or whatever. I'm gonna go write poems.
An older Black woman calling me baby is like the equivalent of just being hugged and held and
Yeah, like come here, baby. I'm like, well, I guess now you're my grandmother, so this
and
is what.
and if she's from New Orleans, if she says baby,
Oh,
forget it. Forget it. It's a wrap.
I think there's like with regards to language, it speaks a lot empathy wise, if that's the foundation, that you have to have these lived experiences so that you can relate, because I think relation speaks volumes in ways that words just aren't suitable enough to. It says a lot when you are you are scarred physically or emotionally speaking, and you're in the presence of someone who shows those same moments of trauma. There's a conversation being had there that are going to do way more than a conversation, whatever language of the day is. And so I think that for people who are trying to, I guess, speak to an audience, it's important that we have, we're not just solely in the scholarly context, because it's one of these things where sometimes I see that a lot, like with regards to language online.
Oh no.
Oh,
Senay, come back to us. I feel like we were right on the precipice of something very beautiful.
I know. We're about to have
I know,
a
I was like-
breakthrough.
While he's coming back, I want to ask you both. Oh, yes, you're back.
There you are.
Oh, sorry. There must have been.
You were on the
Wow.
precipice of saying something beautiful, and it was like
And then the haters just came and got me, right?
it was about you were moving towards the internet.
Oh yeah, with the internet, I don't see a lot of empathy for others on the internet. I feel like because it's so accessibility of language, and more importantly, the experiences behind language aren't present. And so, whereas, whether you're in a barbershop or you're on the corner, or, in these modicum of expressions where these things are created in the first place, you're devoid of that, and you don't necessarily identify with who's speaking to you. And so oftentimes you see these things being said and retweeted, and you feel a certain way about it because the character, or rather the origin story there, is a little suspect. And there's something being said there. And so it's hard to really, I don't know, grasp that in a way that, for me, always on the personal. I don't have a voicemail on my phone. I don't pretend to be a Luddite in any capacity, but I do minimize my engagements and the way I speak via apps or this phone. I had to re-download Zoom just because I get overloaded. No, this is an overload sometimes. So I just try to be mindful, because I feel like in how I try to connect with others, sometimes it just doesn't do me justice in the manner that I feel is acceptable for how I'm trying to present myself.
I mean, the internet also. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I'm done.
I mean, just listening to you kind of talking about how words need to be within sort of like contextualized within knowing who's speaking or kind of what experience they're speaking from and how helpful that is for contextualizing what someone's saying. I mean, the internet also has its own language. It has its own vocabulary and its own forms. And like, how has that raised and or lowered empathy? You know, does it promote empathy? Does it eat empathy? Like, what is it? You know, I feel like you could make arguments for both.
I think the internet's terrible in regards to this particular topic. I feel like it's really weaponized pain or weaponized trauma. And I don't mean it in terms of people who are victimized. I mean in terms of the people who exploit the victims or manipulate, you know, financial.
No, come back, Senay.
I was actually going to say that I have the opposite opinion about empathy and the internet. I've, you know, it connects us. It helps us build with people that. Hold on, I'm going to let him finish his thought.
No. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
I'm having technical difficulties.
Yeah. I, it's not your fault. Wi-Fi is on. You know, we're all a little bit unstable today. But I was saying that I've had the opposite. I see how in the larger scope, it looks like there's not a space for empathy on the internet because of what we say, especially because corporations weaponize our own trauma, like, and try to sell it back to us, you know. And I can't imagine being a Black person and having everybody all of a sudden be like, "We're with you," and then they start selling T-shirts and like all the you know what I mean? And then a month later they're like, you know, y'all are done protesting, so we can pack it up and leave, right? But for me though, with empathy, like, it's the internet makes a very large, chaotic world feel smaller and more digestible. And for those of us seeking people that empathize or relate with us or live what we live, right? Like, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be able to build an entire community of folks that not everybody's a fat Latina woman that is like one of my main goals, which is what I call my readers, but they're looking for someone that feels like them and for someone that's gonna relate with them and someone that's at least gonna like make them feel a little bit more understood in this world, right? And so that's my job, to remind people of their humanity as a writer. And so the internet was allowed for that to happen, right? Like, I was talking the other day with a trans woman, and we were talking about how the similarities of dating while fat and dating while trans, not that they're the same thing, but we both deal with like men being ashamed of us and wanting to date us secretly and like all of these things. I would have never had that conversation with somebody if it wasn't for the internet giving me the language to do so, you know? And so I experienced a little bit on the other end, but I guess the internet is we got to fight through all the muck to find some beauty in there, but there is empathy and there is connection and community.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rooted in negativity. I agree with you with regards to building community. Of course, I think that we will be able to. I think I'm still considered millennial. With regards to like enabling us the opportunity to find like-minded people, without a doubt. I think that there are experiences and relationships that I've been able to build that there's no way that this would have been possible because this person's thousands of miles away. I can't physically engage with them. I think to your point about language, I've learned a lot in terms of, as an observer, to communities that I'm not a part of, how they engage with each other in a much more natural way. I feel like, maybe I could be wrong, as a watching comments and conversations being had online than if I was in person and they were speaking amongst themselves, because my presence might exude or influence maybe I don't know the right way to put it, you know, them acting a certain way because I'm there.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that part.
You're invading their space as
Right.
opposed to on the internet, their space is still theirs, and we get to be a fly on the wall, right?
Right. So I just want to make that clear. I'm with you. I think I was more speaking. I think recently. I think because maybe Allison brought up the corporations and the double speak of how marketing is being done. And so I think that's maybe where my mind was, because I think that's
and that's hella valid. I mean, that's hella valid, especially for those of us with platforms, right? When it's Latinx History Month. All of a sudden, everybody wants a Latina. I have a Twitter thing later. I'm like, you guys, are you gonna invite me to this shit in November?
No.
You know.
The answer is no. I mean, I agree with both of you. It's definitely a double-edged sword, and in a lot of ways can be what we make it. But it for sure allows people to get out of pocket with fewer consequences more often. You know, whether it's corporations just like literally talking out the side of their mouth, or people blackfishing, you know, or like co-opting language. Like we all see that, where they're like, yes, hunty sister girl, and you're like, who are you talking to right now? Like, what are you saying?
I hate that everybody uses sis now. Like, hey sis, yeah. You know, like that. I'm like, that used to be a sacred thing that only Black women used. And if a Black woman called you sis, it was an honor that they gave you, not that you fucking decided to take for yourself. Sorry, the internet pisses me off. TikTok.
TikTok. And knowing where, again, language in a lot of ways can be code, right? Like, just like you're saying, it can be code for we're in the same family. Knowing the history of that, knowing what language came from, for example, ball culture. You know, I know that's a very sacred thing for people who found homes in ball culture who couldn't find homes anywhere else, and were able to identify each other by the language that was used between them. And then that gets co-opted by McDonald's, or by just, like some teenager with a TikTok who now it's like cool and trendy. And it's like, that can be a form of violence. Like, you're taking my life force in a way. You're taking you're cherry picking pieces of my identity, you know, for profit or for clout or whatever. And you're doing it wrong. And you're using it in a way that like it doesn't make sense. You know, again, all language, whether it is a series of colloquialisms or in a, you know, basement culture in New York City, or a colonizer's language, all language has rules, all language has structure, all language has, you know, these, whether we realize it or not. And you have to be an insider in order to realize that. You know, I told you I was taking Spanish lessons, and last year I went to Puerto Rico and I was in Louisa, and I was all excited to use my Spanish. I can understand anything because the way they speak, it's such a specific way of speaking, and like they drop a lot of S's. Someone told me, I thought this was such a beautiful way to say this. I think you'll appreciate this, Yesika, that we hold the words in our mouth. You don't let it like out of your mouth, right? Like como está, like you hold it in your mouth. I thought that was such like a beautiful way to say it, right?
That is beautiful.
But that meant that I couldn't understand. Like I was like, and I met this fine dude, and we tried our best. We tried so hard, and he couldn't understand me, and I couldn't understand him, and it was like a wrap. It was like, we're gonna have to let it go. You know, it's just not gonna happen. But I respect. But that's like, you know, I was in a country, in a town, in a space, and there was like, I'm not from there. I don't, you know, I tried, but I've been learning Spanish from a book, you know, from a teacher, and that's okay.
Same thing when I did it a Jamaican, and I was just like, I don't know. You're beautiful.
Like, you fine though.
You're fine, but I don't know. No idea. But okay, you could kiss me, yeah. But I don't know anything else.
Sometimes you gotta let the body language do the talking, you know.
So I actually feel like we kind of sort of started to stray into this zone a little bit a minute ago. But is there, and I think like, you know, this definitely depends on who's speaking, but what is our responsibility to think empathetically when we're telling stories in the public sphere? And also, what's the line between empathy, imagination, homage, inspiration, and appropriation? And can we try to define that line a little bit? Because I think especially thinking about the conversations we're having on the internet and people kind of like running around collecting things from, some people don't even know where, like some people are using Yes Queen and they don't know it came from ball culture, and when you slow people down and say, do you know where that came from? And they start to move backwards, they start to realize, oh shit, this has a root, this has a source. I didn't realize what I was sort of using. So I think like, what can we kind of like look at where that line is and like define it a little bit just as an exercise?
Well, yeah, I think it's really important, something that's really important for me to note. And like, if it's one thing that I'm able to put out into the zeitgeist, it's that literally everything is a story. Everything is a narrative. Stories aren't limited to what we see on TV or what we read in books. It's what we tell ourselves. It's the history we tell ourselves. It's the headlines, especially the headlines in newspapers. And the words that comprise these stories is what comes to form our beliefs about the way the world works and what it is to be a human being in this world, right? A very recent, most recently, something that caught my eye this morning was a lot of the headlines. You heard that there was this militia group, they're called a militia group, who the FBI unraveled some plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan and take over the government, right? And so all the headlines are calling this group a militia group. They're not calling it a gang, they're not calling it a terrorist organization, they're calling it a militia group. And the first thing that I thought of was, oh, militias are protected under the Second Amendment, right? So they immediately, there's someone who's looking to overthrow the government, our own government. We're talking about treason, we're kidnapping, violence, all these terrible things. But because it's under, like, that's a choice to use the word militia and to not use this bevy of other words that we have that, had they been Black, brown, Muslim, you name it, can you imagine? Can you imagine, plotting to kidnap the governor and overthrow the government? Like, the way that the heads of state would be mobilizing right now and locking everybody up that they see in like so this is a story. It's very important that we understand that this is a story, that this is a militia, that these are, they're white people. These are the same people who were on Capitol Hill with their guns, and nobody said anything, and there was no, riot police or anything like that, because they're militia, they're protected, they have constitutional rights, like all of these things. If they had been called thugs, if they had been called terrorists, that would be a different story. But these are all stories that we're telling ourselves and we're telling each other, and this is how it gets remembered, and this is what comprises history. The same thing, with religion. And just because it's a story, that doesn't mean it's, made up or in imagination, but these are stories, the way we frame the world that we live in and communicate it to each other. These are all stories that we tell ourselves and each other. So when we're talking about empathy, and we're talking about who we're using empathy towards and the gazes that we are looking upon them, who is that empathy for, right? And the words that we're using to name groups of people, to name ourselves, to name the protagonists and the antagonists of the story, who are we empathizing with? And so it's really important to keep that sort of lens on at all times and not drop it because we think we're reading something that's objective, as supposedly journalism is, or a history book, or a critique, or anything that anybody tells you, really. And I think it's important, especially as a marginalized person in this country, to have empathy for yourself first and foremost, and see where you are in this story that's being told, and that's being told to you, and understand where they're trying to place you, and make sure you stay strong in your empathy for yourself and how you're naming yourself and how they're naming you, and then move accordingly.
You just, oh my God.
Yeah, I was like, man.
I was so into everything you were saying. But for me, how I keep myself, my checks and balances for when I'm writing and about what I'm trying to create empathy for something that I'm writing about, I try to keep it very basic. Like, I write what I know, right? And so like I write a lot in the first person. Most of my writing so far has been based around myself. Who knows later on if eventually I get fucking, I don't think I'll get fed up with my family because they're drama. Um, but but like within my family there's multitudes, right? Like there are like Afro Latinos in my family. There are white passing Latinos in my, there are white Latinos in my family. There are queer people in my family. You know what I mean? So it's like that's what I know, and I could pull from my experiences with my family members and write about that and create about that. But I'm not gonna go and pretend I have an experience that I don't, that I have a lived experience that I don't have. Especially I think maybe it's really specific for me because I write poetry. So a lot of times folks ask me like, oh, could you write a poem about queer love? And can you write about queer people falling in love? And I'm like, I don't, I that's not my, I don't know. But like, I used to say, I can't write about that because I don't know queer love. But then I realized, oh no, I'm not being smart. I could just not use genders in my work, you know? And so then I had to go back and like use they them pronouns and stuff, and sometimes and be intentional from when I say they them and when I say he she, like if I'm writing like, because sometimes I am referencing like relationships between men and women and the violence between that and all that, and it has to be that. But that's kind of how I've learned. It's like it's a check, like whenever I feel like getting creative or giving myself creative license, I'm like, do I know this? Am I just making up am I making up experiences for a person of an identity that I don't have? And like, and if I am, like, why? You know, why do I like, why don't I just find a trans poet and direct people to that poet? You know, why don't I find queer poetry and be like, I don't write that now, but look at these people that are doing this really beautifully, and like check them out, right? And I think if I were to write a novel, it would change in the future, like because then you have to create characters and you want to create representation. But I will always do it with checking in with the people in my life that represent that specific group that I'm writing to. You know, like if I would ever write a novel, I would want Black characters in my novel, but I'm not gonna go make up some Black person I've never, like, you know what I mean? Like I'm gonna base it on who's been in my life and what I do know and what is true. And maybe I won't make it the like, it's just, I think it's just having it's not even compassion or empathy. The word is, it's just having like venerating other experiences that are not yours and being like, these are such beautiful stories. And if I'm going to take on the job of telling this story for you, or this story for an identity that doesn't normally get highlighted and I have a platform, then I have to be very careful and very intentional and check in with people of that identity before I let the whole world see it. You know, like what do you think? Am I appropriating? I think we all need to have a community around us that checks us when we're not showing up in our best selves, right? Because then I don't want to show up somewhere and be like, I'm an authority on Blackness because I have Black friends. You know what I mean? Like that's not, like, I don't think nobody ever, like there's some people that don't have that, where they check in with their peers, and then all of a sudden they're out there talking all kinds of nonsense, and I'm like, girl, let me pull you over after this panel because you were doing a lot in there. And but that's kind of where I've seen where I try to have empathy the most in my work. It's like understanding that I have access to tell stories, but just because I do doesn't mean all the stories are for me to tell.
I think for me, with regards to, I think you were basically referencing, you know, delineating boundaries, right? Borders within language, and how, you know, what's right and what isn't right, what's going too far, what isn't going far enough. I think for me, the most empathetic way that I can deliver that is by being consistent and by a level of or a degree of discipline or militancy in what I represent and how I present myself within the things that I represent. Because I think that, you know, not trying to like call out posts, but I think oftentimes in my experiences, you know, people are in spaces where creatives, I should say, just to be specific, creatives sometimes find themselves in spaces where they maybe feel that they have to let things slide in order to, by having proximity to certain power structures or certain people with clout, however you perceive it, they let certain things slide where in other context, in other contextual situations, they would never do that. And I think that people degree to a certain extent, oh, I have proximity to X Black friend, or I have proximity to X Latina friend, and this wasn't a problem for them. Therefore, I now will incorporate this within my daily vocabulary, or I will incorporate this within my online persona, and that's that. I don't think many people are being malicious when these like oops moments happen. Some people are, and I think more oftentimes institutions are, but individuals, I don't think that they are. I think that oftentimes they are around people who are unfortunately put in these representational roles because they're the only one, or they're one of the only ones, and this familiarity that you have with said person leads you to think that boundaries are more grayer than they are. And with language, as was said earlier, there are rules. And, I understand with, I think a lot of the Latin-based languages, the Romance languages, I should say, there's a masculine and feminine. And I think that to a certain extent, linguistics of today would say like a lot of it is antiquated, right? Because we now have more nuanced gendered expressions, so some of it's fallen out. But there is something to be said within the rules of language and how we speak, because if you want to address certain issues or certain topics, you use certain words, and I think that just because X group can use them doesn't necessarily mean that I can. And I am keen enough to recognize that with respect to my community. So I'm sorry. I'm keen enough to recognize that with regards to other people's communities. So I would only expect that the same would be done for my own. Is that done? No. But what I can say is you can't see me having proximity to people who exploit, who abuse the lines. And I think for me, that's the best way that I can, in my immediate life, that's the best that I think that I can do. And also because I don't have so much energy. There's only so much energy that you can have fighting violence. It's going to take away from you and take away from what I'm trying to do in my life. So I can't necessarily like world police, but when it's presented to me, I shut it down, and I think, or it's presented to people that I love and I know, I shut it down, and I just deal with the consequences. I'm sorry, your college friend, your dorm mate from Ohio or whatever, thinks that they can use certain words that they cannot, but in my presence, I let it be known who I am. And I think that militancy, or rather discipline, I respect when I see it, like with regards to talking about ball culture. And, when I see like my queer friends being like, yo, letting it be known, like where this comes from and who was the originators, I'm like, that's how it should be, and I think that there's maybe a level of accountability that we can all speak to, and I'm including myself, that we're not being held accountable if we want to maintain the pillars of certain aspects of our culture and of our communities that we come from respectfully. We have to be more active in that.
What's something that I've learned, and as someone, I'm a screenwriter, and so my job requires that I put myself into other people's brains and bodies and say what I think that they would say in a certain situation, right? And it's not always Black women. It's different people all the time. And in this idea, and so this comes up a lot, right? Of like who we're writing for, who's allowed to write for who. And I remember a couple of years ago when I was at Google and I was working on this project with the Equal Justice Initiative, and it was this project around lynching in America. And the Equal Justice Initiative had charged us with taking data that they had found around lynching and the period of racial terror in the United States from like Reconstruction roughly until the Civil Rights era, and making it accessible, making it something that was interesting that people want to check out. And we made this like whole multimedia thing, right? And so my creative director, I was a writer producer on it, and my creative director was white. And so we were like traveling around the South in a minivan for 4 months talking to descendants of lynching victims. So shenanigans ensued. And I remember we got into a fight once and we were arguing, not like a fight. And to this day, this person's a very good friend of mine, but we were arguing and I was telling him what white people were like, basically. And I was like, white people are going to, say this, they're going to see this and they're going to do this. And he was like, oh, you think you know white people better than I do? And I was like, yes. Like, absolutely. Because out of necessity, oppressed peoples will always know the oppressor better than they even know themselves, because we have to stay so hyper vigilant, right? And we have to know where danger is coming from. We have to know their movements, their sayings, their signaling, like all of this. And this goes for all oppressed groups, right? And people who are, oppressing them. And just the way that I know as a writer, I have to know, because I was raised and formally educated in the United States. And so I know Greek mythology, I know canon, right? I know this British literary canon and what's considered American canon. And I also know Orishas. I also know, my own mythologies and backgrounds and spiritualities and stories. And I know my own canon that white people do not know. I know African history, African American history, some Latinx history, and all of white history, because I was forced to, right? But I would be very hard pressed to meet any white person who has had the same education that I have had, name, any Yoruba Orishas, right? Or even 5 African American authors, to keep it a buck, And so there's this idea of, well, if you can write white people, why can't I write Black people? And this is why. There's an inauthenticity, because I have to know who you are and I have to know where you're coming from. And I do, by default and by necessity. But when it's the other way around, it's like this idea of punching up versus punching down, in comedy. When it's the other way around, it tends to, I don't know if I have the language to explain why it does not work, but 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. It's an appropriation, it's a cosplay, there's like a fantasy on it. Very rarely, not always. I mean, I can look to The Wire to say, these are white men who wrote Black characters very, very well. But on average, when we're looking at whose story, like you're saying, Yesika, whose story that we're telling and why, and Senay, when we're looking at, who we're letting play in our faces and when, I think you have to take that piece of it into consideration, this piece of oppression and this piece of who has lived in what society and who has had to survive in what society, and the knowledge that they've gained and internalized. And is it coming from a place of entitlement, of a place of like, well, I can write anything, or I can, tell anyone's story because I can, or because I have a very deep knowledge and understanding of this culture because I have been forced to survive in it, for however long.
Yeah. I had recently, I was thinking of this when I was speaking. I had a whole dragging on Twitter because at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a really small poem on Twitter, and it was about longing, right? Like my mother was on the phone with her family in El Salvador. Borders were closed. You can't go and come back from each other, right? Everything was scary. And so then I was just like this yearning for touch, this longing to be each other. Like, I've known this. What is this but another board? Like, what is this but another border? What is this but another wall? I didn't realize what I was saying, right? Like, I'm not a doctor. What was that?
Oh, I know.
No, you're good.
Okay. I'm like, wait.
Gotcha.
I didn't realize I didn't realize what I was saying, and that the fact that I'm not an undocumented person, I'm a US citizen. I don't have that lived experience, right? Folks on Twitter let me know that I was romanticizing an undocumented person's struggle, right? And my first defense was just like, no, I know this. Like, my mother wasn't documented up until I was like a preteen. Like, I have family that's like, you know, that's crossed over. Like, you don't know why I can't go back home. Like, my whole thing was to get so defensive because I was just like, this is my story. I've lived it. I feel it. Like, although like I didn't mean to slight anybody, but then I had to really sit down and listen to what you were saying, punching up versus punching down, right? I'm like, this is a group of a group that is marginalized in a way that I'm not, right? And I have privilege over them. So it's my job in this situation. It doesn't matter what is my thing. I did two things wrong. The poem wasn't long enough for me to explain what I was thinking. So it left a lot of open-ended things. So I'm gonna write something like that. It has to be well fucking written. It can't just be a thought I'm gonna put out there, you know? And two, I appropriated something like borders and walls, and I could have said something else. What is this but another country between us? Or what is this but something? And so that was one of my biggest lessons in something that I felt was a story that I knew really, really fucking well. And I'm like, I could write about this, you know, like my mom and dad were undocumented. And then like, I was there, what they call the anchor baby, you know, like I lived that. I lived the food stamp side. I lived the translating everything. But then I've been like, no. If a group of marginalized people tell you, we don't want you fucking telling our stories, then you have to be like, or not like, we don't want you telling our stories like this. Then I've got to be like, all right, like, then if I'm gonna write about people and then I wrote a piece that's gonna come on the New York Times later, but it's about like being like sorry. But yeah, so I just changed the lens to like, I come after this. So this is part of my people's story, and now this is where I'm at, and so yeah. But Allison made me really I want
to stay
to talk forever
all day, and I feel awkward. I keep accidentally interrupting because I can't tell if it's done or not because of the connection. But
sorry,
we're almost to 3 hours. We're almost to 3 hours. 3 o'clock. I want to close on two things. One is, we'll do the first one first. Can power and empathy coexist?
Definitely.
Ooh.
I feel like for me, I lived that in my career. Yesika, who I am as an entity, will not exist if those two things. Like, I am powerful because I create work that promotes empathy, and I have the power of the communities that connect with my work, and together, like in community, like the more numbers we are, the more powerful we are, and we can't have numbers if we're not empathetic of each other. That's my answer.
When you say power, what do you mean by that, Anna?
I mean, I think it's a little bit open to interpretation on purpose, because I think there are ways that power corrupts, and then there are ways that power can be worn and carried with responsibility. And so I guess sort of in that question is a little bit like sort of my hope that power and empathy can coexist. Like, it can go either way, I think, is sort of how I see it. My hopeful answer to that is yes, but I was kind of thinking about that question that way. But I think you can answer it how you want. You know?
I'm gonna say no, not necessarily because of intent, but mainly because I feel like the fruition of what I see when these things coexist within each other. I think, like, individually, we empathize with others, and we maybe even empower others. But looking at it like in the lens of, like, unfortunately, this capitalist system that we're in, I feel like sometimes we draw from one, we extract from one and give to others. Like, there's a very transactional relationship. And I'm like always like self-critical about that, like in terms of like, who am I harming? Like, for perfect example with the food stuff, right? I grew up in the 6th district. It's a historic Black neighborhood in Long Beach. And as time changes, there's ethnic succession, and we have now a pretty sizable Central American community that lives here. And I think I was the first generation to really like go to school with a lot of the kids. And we also have a Cambodian community here. And I think that when I started doing the food thing, I was like, I'm going to just help my people, right? And I wasn't necessarily thinking like the Black people, not in a conscious sense. I just meant like my people in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And then one day, like one of the neighbors came to me in my mother's building, it's like 40, 50 units. And it's like, she's like, hey, is it okay if I get some food? And I'm like, are you hungry? Yeah, of course. But then it made me feel bad. She's a Nicaraguan lady. It made me feel bad because I was like, why she think she couldn't get no food? Is it because of all the Black? I'm thinking like maybe she sees all the Black people standing outside in the line to get the food. Maybe she thinks this is only a Black thing and I'm gonna say no. So then that's what I mean about my intent. My intent necessarily wasn't to, my intent is to feed anyone who's hungry, my intent is just to be a resource. The unfortunate reality of this world is that certain people recognize what is a resource and what isn't, and more importantly, some certain people are able to utilize these resources. I think that as a writer, I'm so blessed and privileged. My grandmother, who was born and raised in this country in Memphis, she graduated as an adult illiterate. She could not read or write, and she didn't learn how until she was 30, into her early 30s, when she came to California. And so for me, just 2 generations later, to then have a working career, I don't necessarily think that, I think she's a product of her environment. Sorry, just to be on topic. I think she's a product of her environment, but also by being a product of her environment, she did not emphasize reading or learning how to be an orator or that wasn't an emphasis of her. So in a certain extent, she kind of drew, in her power, in her capacity, because I grew up in her house, she drew away from me resources that could have better put me in a better position in life, not on purpose, just because that's just the reality of her lived experience. So I think about these things often. I don't necessarily have a definite answer now that I think about it. Maybe I'll take the no away and I'll say I'm inconclusive, or I'm hesitant to because it's something I think about a lot.
I mean, it also, just hearing you speak about your experience makes me feel like you're an example of combining empathy with influence, even if you don't want to use the word power.
Sure.
And
out of my power.
Hope that these things can coexist. It is possible to, but I don't know. Allison, I feel like you're going to have such gems.
Well, I had time to think.
Yes, Allison, tell me everything.
I feel like it's chemistry, right? It's a science experiment. You're in the lab and you have all these vials of different elements. And when you're mixing power and empathy, you got to be real careful about the measurements, because if you put in too much power, you're like, ooh, it's manipulation, right? And so you got to pull that back a little bit. And so I think they can exist, but you got to look at the chemistry and how much you're putting into that beaker, because it might explode if you use the wrong measurements.
Maybe it just needs a stabilizing agent, like humility.
I mean, like, we're all writers, right? And they say that there's like power in feeling seen and acknowledged and all of that. Like, I don't know, when I think of power, I don't think in the traditional, like, president, like government, I don't know, these fucking white people.
Authority.
I don't think of that. Like, I think of the power of, like, I didn't do any of the protests because I've been COVID and whatever, right? Like, all of that. So
you don't have to explain yourself to us.
Yeah, whatever.
You don't have to explain yourself to us at all.
So, but no. But I want to say that I sat and I watched, right? Like, all the protests and camera and like and videos, and like watching all of these people feel so empowered by their voices, right? And seeing each other and like seeing like what the sign said or whatever, like even sitting at home watching on a screen, I felt so empowered, so like, oh my God, like this is finally something's happening. And how can I help? Like, how can I help? What can I do? Like, let me figure out where I could get in, like I could organize from my computer and help everybody. And that made me feel like I could do something, you know. And I feel that that's kind of where empathy and power meet, right? Like we see each other, and then we say, I see you, and I got you, and I'm gonna take care of you. And there's so much power in putting out a fridge with food. And like, as a Central American, my mom would be like, go ask the man if I could get some food. And then when I tell her yes, she'd be like, all right, grab a bag. And I'm gonna grab a bag because we're gonna take this food, you know. Like there's so much. It just makes me so, like, I get so excited because I feel like when we see each other, when we find each other, and we give each other permission to, like, to just exist and to take, and to take as much as everybody else takes, you know. And I think that that's the most power that we can give to people who were told that they had no kinds of power, you know. Like, I come from parents who escaped a civil war, you know, and so to come now in a place where, if I wanted to, I have 122,000 people that say, hey, Yesika, I connect with you. And I could tell them something. And then they're like, yeah, you know? And I mean, like, a lot of them might be trolls, but still, it's so powerful. I feel so like, and Allison just made me feel like I have to go write a million things.
Yay, do it.
Okay, my last question is, so I saw this artist who I have a huge creative crush on, Serpent with Feet, perform, and he stops and reads poetry sometimes in his shows. And he read a poem, and then he thanked the author on stage for giving him more language because it gave him more, in his words, emotional real estate. And I was really taken by that description of what language can do. So if you can articulate an experience, or someone can articulate experience you weren't able to put into words, it can help you metabolize it or understand it or reframe it. So who are you reading right now, or is there someone whose words have given you more emotional real estate? And this will be our closing question.
I want to say today, Senay and Allison, like, I like, sometimes, you know, we do panels, we all sit on panels, and sometimes you're like, let this person finish talking. So then, you know, and then you're like, oh, they're gonna go back to this person again. And so, but y'all have given me such beautiful, like, this is beautiful. So thank you so much. And I'm excited. Allison, this is the first we meet, and stuff, and I'm just excited to learn more of you, and just seeing, I don't know, it's just like people that are doing the work of what their words already do, when they themselves are doing the work, is such a beautiful thing to find. And so I've been doing a lot more of searching for poetry and for literature in living forms. And so today y'all are that. Y'all are literature, like, existing, just existing. And so thank you for that.
That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me.
Yeah,
I've never been called literature
that.
before. That's beautiful. I'm gonna cry. Thank you, and likewise. I don't know. I was trying to find out before this, when you initially posed the question, Anna. There's a quote. I think it's Toni Morrison, but it might not be. Who absolutely has given me so much in terms of emotional real estate and permission to use language in ways that I didn't know was possible. But it was definitely a woman writer who said, as a writer, I'm paraphrasing, but as a writer, my job is to put in words what cannot be put into words. And I always thought that was so beautiful. And it's such almost a futile effort that we're all constantly trying to do, right? We're constantly trying to, like, you know, take these big hearts that we have, and everything that's in it, and all the rage and love and joy and bliss and depression and anxiety and loneliness and fear, and, like, you know, especially as a poet, Yesika, like, create a feeling, you know, like, and that feeling, you all know it when you're reading something and you have to put the book down and, like, walk around for a second. Like, you're just like, I can't even deal with this right now, because they just hit you so hard in a way that, like, you didn't know was possible. Like, that to me is the beauty of, and the power of words and empathy. Right now I'm reading this book, A Visitation of Spirits, by Randall Keenan, who actually just passed very recently. And this book was recommended to me by Terrell Ivan McCraney who is a creator of David Makes Man and wrote Moonlight. And he said this is his favorite book in the world that he comes back to over and over and over again. And I'm reading it now and I understand why. And it's absolutely, this is a book that I read a paragraph and I put it down and I like stare out the window for 20 minutes and think about life. And it's going places that I've never been before as a reader that I really, really appreciate. So this is my current recommendation.
Hold the book up even closer. Oh, okay. I'm writing it down.
The Visitation of Spirits, Randall Keenan.
Student.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't give a writer. I already read her work, but she's just doing so much beautiful work. And she's doing something with y'all, a workshop, Alicia Wise, who is a dear, dear friend of mine, but is a poet.
Oh, cool.
Like, it's just a poet that whenever there's a video or a poem she posts, I'm like, oh, I have to stop everything. And yeah, Alicia Wise she's a gift. And she's just the kind of person that when she just, anything, she's like, oh, here's a poem, here's a video. Yes, this is what I'm doing for the next 3 minutes, because when Ms. Wise speaks, we listen. So she's someone who does that for me. Like when I hear like her work, I'm like, all right, well, I can't hear anybody talk again for an hour because I needed like.
I love that.
I recently got into it with some people because I like publicly verbalize my political post of the year, and it always gets me in trouble, and it just kind of reminded me. I'm reading this book. It's called The Miseducation of the Negroes by Dr. Carter Woodson, who's one of the first Black sociologists. And it reminds me that a lot of times, this whole conversation has been about language, essentially. It reminds me oftentimes that a lot of the positioning or the fixtures that we see with regards to whatever respective communities that we're a part of, creative, cultural, or otherwise, it isn't necessarily a merit-based position or a merit-based hierarchy. Oftentimes with power, you see I'm roping it back. Oftentimes with power, we we find a lot of the choices being made prior to the decision. The decision being made prior to the choice even becoming in front of us. And so, it just kind of reminded me. Everyone just jumped on me because, it's so polarized, the whole Biden-Trump thing. And I was like, hey, I'm voting for a third party. And I thought that was like a neutral, I thought I was going to get like, okay, cool. Like, but if anything, I felt more animosity as if I came out as a Trump supporter. But that's okay. That's the way it is. Everyone's who they are, and we respect it. But with regards to what I'm reading, it reminded me because Dr. Woodson, he talks about just like how hierarchies are fixated. He says like with a lot of contempt. He's the third, I believe he's the third Black person to get a doctorate from Harvard. And he said that, it took me 20 years to unlearn the trauma that I experienced in learning at Harvard University. And so in knowing that, I just am reminding myself too that we all are on paths of unlearning a lot of the things that was pushed upon us knowingly and unknowingly. And so it makes me more empathetic because I'm reminded of that. Because I remember within my own journey, I was once where a lot of my detractors were previous, or are currently, I should say. And so because of that, it makes me just much more kind. I'm much more kinder at this point in my life than I probably ever have. And I just appreciate all the opportunities that I get to showcase that kindness, that learned kindness.
That's a great way to put that. I love
yes.
Hold hands and like shed a tear because everything the last three of you just said was really stunning. So thank you for sharing your minds and your hearts and your thoughts on language. And thanks for bringing it to Compound and to Girls School. And yes, Alicia Wise is going to be teaching a workshop at Girls School's The Lobby Festival on the 17th, which is lobby.girlschool.com. Girls School has an X in it. And yeah, thank you, Allison. Thank you, Yesika. Thank you, Senay.
Thank you for bringing us together, Anna. This was lovely.
Together today. Really
Thank you, Anna.
appreciate you. More soon, I hope.
You're wonderful.
You are. So nice to
Thank
meet
you.
you all.
Pleasure to see you tonight. Haven't seen you in a few years tonight, and nice to meet you, Allison. Thank you. I'm gonna go eat lunch now. Bye.